Yeah, thanks you so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to get to talk to you all, and thanks so much for coming. And obviously to Patrick and Richard for putting this together. I really appreciate it. So I'm just going to talk about the various kinds of temporalities that can be read through plastic and the ways that I've been trying to think through them for many years now. And what I'm going to be presenting does come from the book, so hopefully it'll be of interest to everyone. But I'm also happy to answer, a large field of other questions. One of the other things that I sort of do in relationship, sort of in addition to a kind of theoretical academic practice, is I work with a collective of scientists and artists called the Synthetic Collective, and we do all kinds of other work, like both scientific research. We put together exhibitions, and we do some policy work as well. So happy to answer kind of like a range of questions in addition to what I'm going to be presenting. So I'm going to start with a kind of question of inheritance. And for me, the reason why starting with inheritance is important is because I think that one of the things that kind of becomes really automatically apparent when we start to think about plastic is that at this point it's intractable, right? It's such a new material. It's only been really in existence in its kind of fully synthetic form since 1907, and yet at the same time our world is now so fundamentally composed of this material that we actually we need to grapple with it regardless of kind of our positions in relationship to it, or how we're actually feeling about it. So in other words, like, plastic has radically reshaped the world and our relations to it, even as the questions of plastics, how maybe modifying the world, also speaks to what Jacques Derrida calls the aporia of inheritance, which is that we also are so constituted by this material. It so shapes our everyday lives and the ways in which we understand ourselves as subjects, the kinds of things that we come to have expectations about in terms of travel, convenience, global food production, et cetera, that in some ways the kinds of questions that we would even ask about plastic are already constituted by that material or by that set of materials. So this is part of the reason why I think that it's important to think about it in relationship to kind of questions of temporality, because immediately when you start to think about questions of inheritance, the question of temporality isn't necessarily just a linear one. It's not necessarily just a linear trajectory, but it has this kind of backward and forward movement. So again, for the philosopher Jacques Derrida, inheritance is always in the making as it works through us. So I use also the word inheritance not so much for a temporal reason, but for more political reasons in addition to that, because I think that one of the things that it alerts us to is the ways in which structures of power, or, as I've argued in the book and elsewhere, that plastic in some ways can be understood as a kind of infrastructure of whiteness, and the creation of whiteness and the kind of perpetuation of what that means as a kind of racial category and how it's divided the world. And you can see that in like very kind of concrete ways, but you can also see it in relationship to these kind of philosophical relations, which is that inheritance really refers to how structures of privilege and power are passed on, right? So one of the fundamental ways we use this word in English is obviously, through its definition of both kind of like legally and informally, is to speak of property relations, the types of things that we're going to inherit from our parents or grandparents if we come from enough wealth that is something that is going to come to us, right? Or if we come from enough of a situatedness that's something that's going to come to us. So inheritance is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as the succession to property, a title, office, etc., a coming into or taking possession of something as one's birthright, possession, ownership, or right of possession. And so you'll see, like, in that definition that comes from the Oxford English Dictionary, I think the word possession gets mentioned like 3 or 4 times, right? So instead of thinking of inheritance as something that is about the kinds of worlds in the making, or like what is it that we're passing on in terms of a kind of cultural value, or even in terms of kind of genetic relations, what it's really kind of indicating is the ways in which within the kind of Western colonial and English framing, there's this way in which inheritance is really tied to questions of property, right? Really tied to questions of ownership. And I think that like this really illuminates, I think, a lot of the ways in which we can also think about plastics. So inheritance as a right and a possession and a property indicates how Western modernity conceives of intergenerational time, right? And here, this is part of the reason why I'm really thinking about this in relationship to temporality. So here we become with the world through our objects. Inheritance as property rather than as skills or as ways of being assumes a naturalized relation to capital and to colonial extraction, and is about the ways in which filial relations, patriarchy, and race unfold across generations, consolidating rather than redistributing privilege. So as the American studies scholar George Lipsitz writes, this kind of inheritance works especially through intergenerational transfers of inherited wealth that pass on the spoils of discrimination to succeeding generations. And if this seems like very heady and like a little bit abstract, just to kind of give a couple of sort of more concrete ways to think through it, like one of the ways in which we can sort of really think through this is through something like waste colonialism, right? So we in the West get to benefit from these incredibly large scale systems of waste management, right? Where most of that is shipped to Southeast Asia for disposal, and disposal being a kind of a funny term here, right, where people are just like literally sorting it and having to deal with the consequences, often in a very bodily and material way, right, and it ends up being burned or thrown in rivers or in other kinds of places, because I mean we know for a fact that like it's not like this material it does actually really go very far, right? It's a very recalcitrant material. It's a difficult material to figure out what to do with. And so when I'm thinking about this kind of question of inheritance and property and possession and the relationships to plastic, we can think about how plastics in the places like this or where I come from in Canada and the United States, we really get to benefit from a lot of the uses of plastics, right? It makes our lives so much easier in so many ways. But, you know, say we were living in Jakarta, for example, and had to deal with like the massive amounts of flooding that are constantly happening because of all kinds of things, but one of the reasons being because of the massive amounts of plastics that enter the river systems in and around that city. Obviously, your relationship to plastic would be much more complicated, right? So this is part of what I'm talking about in terms of like the ways in which the kind of accumulation of plastic and the ways in which it allows for a kind of ease of life makes it so that our lives are really so much easier at the expense of other people, right? And then the other kind of question, obviously, is that, as I said at the beginning, is that we can't just say we don't want plastics anymore, right? Even if all plastics manufacturing were to stop tomorrow, which would be amazing but very improbable, we're still going to have to deal with the consequence of this material for a kind of untold amount of time into the future. It's very unknown how long plastics are going to stick around for. Obviously, plastics are obviously not one category either, so they break down at different rates and under different conditions and according to different kinds of chemical compositions, right? And the ways in which that happens has all kinds of different consequences for the bodies of ourselves and the bodies of other beings on this planet. How's everybody doing? Am I speaking too quickly? I realize, oh, it's okay. Okay, good. Just wanted to double check, because I know that there's an accent difference and sometimes that makes it a little difficult to follow. Great. So then the question is like, what do we still do with these inheritances, even if the problem is in some ways completely intractable, right? So for Derrida, again, this means not simply accepting this heritage, right? It's not that we just have to accept the conditions under which we come to live in this world that's so fully saturated by kind of petrochemicals, right? But he says we have to relaunch it otherwise. And not choosing it, since what characterizes inheritance is, first of all, that one does not choose it. It is what violently elects us. But choosing to keep it alive is the question, right? So the question, I think, for us now is like, how do we deal with the kind of massive proliferation of plastics, and what are the kinds of choices that go into keeping it alive or not, right? As a kind of set of materials, and what are the kinds of ethics and politics of that? And so just to kind of, summarize this section, what I think is important about inheritance is that it also introduces a temporal framework that is not about an appeal to a universal chronology. but a time situated outside of any embodied or immaterial time, resonating with what Bernadette Benso-Medecin, building on Barbara Adams, calls timescapes. And I think that this is really important for thinking about kind of temporals and temporalities in a different way outside of the kinds of received notions of just a kind of linear progress narrative that are so deeply embedded in the emergence of something like plastic to begin with, right? That like so much of what caused its emergence to begin with was this real belief in a kind of technological utopianism in terms of being able to create this kind of world that has this fundamental break with what's come before. So to get more into that, oh, sorry, I should have shown you this slide. This is my grandmother. the image is also in the book, but in black and white, and in color, it's even more amazing. Anyway, yeah, I can say more about that, but I won't right now. But this is my grandmother, and you can see her in her kind of quintessential kind of 1950s kitchen in South Carolina. So geologic time. So obviously one of the things that plastic introduces, oh, and I should say that these sets of images, you'll see four that look very similar, and these sets of images are from Perdita Phillips, and this piece is called Plastic Meteorite, and it was created, I think, in 2014, if I'm remembering correctly. So obviously one of the ways in which people have thought about plastics is through its relationships to deep time, right? And by deep time, obviously we mean the kind of time of the earth, or this time that really extends beyond the time of humans, that goes back to, in the case of plastic, the millions of years that it took for fossil fuels to be created through the compression of the lives of plankton and plants primarily, right? So in some ways we can really think of this object as a kind of condensed time. It's almost like millions of years have been squished into one object, right? And at the same time, obviously the millions of years that go into the creation of a plastic item and the kind of indefinite and unknown time frames into the future that it's going to take for that plastic item, for this like plastic meteorite, as she calls it, which was found as it is. It wasn't created by her. It was found as it is on the beach of the Arctic coast in the far regions of Norway. But like, you know, how long this is going to take to decompose or to become something else, not just become something smaller, but rather to actually change its kind of molecular composition, which is, you know, the difference between just like breaking something down and actual decomposition, is really completely, I think, unknown. And I think anybody who sort of pitches you a date is maybe not. I think they're maybe overstepping what their knowledge might actually be. But it does seem like it's going to be a very long time, right? So how long that time is, we don't know. But the time frames seem extremely long. So, you know, these kinds of millions of years that come into the emergence of this object, the indefinite but incredibly long periods of time that it's going to take for this object to then become something else, are seemingly obliterated by the fact that we often use plastic packaging, which this obviously was not, but that's the most common use and interaction that we have with plastics for at most a few months. So compressing deep time into what seems like an eternally replicating present. So this time is not one that sits with the present to fully account for it. Rather, plastic encourages a fleeting time, a fleeting present that eats time. So we can think of plastic as a quintessentially chronophagic material, right? The material that really is taking these millions of years on both ends of time, both the time of the past and the time of the future, to squish it into a present that is endlessly replicating itself in a kind of way that it's sort of like stuck as a kind of impasse or a mire, right? And we can think about this also through Esther Leslie wrote a beautiful book called Synthetic Worlds, and describes the promise of universality in terms of the struggle with and over time. And she's writing about this in relationship to the emergence of different kinds of chemical transformations, and in particular the emergence of Perkins mauve, which is a kind of predecessor to plastics, which is a synthetic dye that was created out of coal tar. And she writes, Time's dominion was to be cracked. Through the accelerating power of chemical reaction, modern magic consists in the short-circuiting of natural processes. So I think that, we can see this precisely in this kind of an object. It's like, it is literally the kind of short-circuiting of natural processes in order to create this kind of a meteorite that has this, both a relationship to the Earth and also something that seems quite different from the types of processes that have come before. So obviously this is a geologic time that collapses into a kind of eternal present. Now another way to think about geologic time, how many of you have seen this or similar types of images before? Many people. So this is the plastiglomerate. It was photographed by Kelly Jasvac. I think the photograph was from, I should know, 2017. But her, Charles Moore, and Patricia Corcoran, two from my work, I worked with both Kelly and Patricia as part of the Synthetic Collective, and they went on this trip to Hawaii where it was well known by locals that these kinds of rock-like substances were being found on the beach, both in situ, so like actually adhering to the kind of rocky surfaces in the lava around the beach, and also as kind of individual objects, as you see here. And they named it plastiglomerate because it is an agglomeration of both plastics and other kinds of materials. And originally the hypothesis when they went there was that it was being created because of the kind of heat from the lava flows. But they quickly discovered that that was actually not the case. That most of these plastiglomerates were being created because people would just go to the beach to have fires, right? Like, as people love to do, right, on the world over, probably for many, many hundreds of thousands of years. And in that process, because there's so much plastic on those beaches there, it's infamous for being one of the world's kind of one of the places where all the currents from the ocean wash up whatever's at sea. And of course, because there's so much plastic at sea at this point, there's just huge amount. Basically, the beach looks like plastic. It doesn't really look like a beach anymore. And so under those conditions, when you have a bonfire, even just a regular campfire, this is what you're inadvertently creating. But again, the question then of like, what is this doing in relationship to geologic time? Like, what happens when plastic kind of literally re-enters back into the geologic layer, right? When it actually becomes a kind of a rock. So here the creation of plastiglomerate complicates the linearity of something, for example, like the Anthropocene thesis, or the ways in which we think about geologic time or the time of the Earth. As this kind of very concrete sort of like linear stages, right? Like, I think we've all seen the maps of the different epochs and eras, right? And it's this very kind of clear-cut thing that like moves through time. But I would want to argue that one of the things that happens with something like the plastiglomerate is that it complicates those notions. It complicates especially this understanding of our current era as potentially being the Anthropocene, or that's what seems to be where we're headed for. And for example, plastic is one of the main stratigraphic markers within the geologic literature of the Anthropocene, obviously the other one being radionuclides. And the Anthropocene has been widely critiqued, obviously as a concept by humanities scholars, primarily because of its lack of accuracy in attributing responsibility for contemporary ecocidal conditions, and its reinstantiation of a universal human, right? So that's the way in which we often hear about the kinds of critiques of the Anthropocene from a humanities perspective. But Catherine Yusof and others have also made clear that one of the other problems with the Anthropocene is the presumption that linear time can be read into the rocks of the Earth, so that we can just read the rocks of the Earth as if it's like a book that goes from beginning to end sequentially. So stratigraphy itself was built on an ordering of the materiality of time through sequential strata. And as Bernadette Benson-Vincent writes again, the Anthropocene is fully enrolled in the linear temporal scheme of Western modernity through its future-oriented chronological timeline. So obviously that kind of narrative of the Anthropocene can be a really useful way to be able to read the Earth and its various phases, but it can also lead to gross simplifications that reinscribes and naturalizes modern linear time, which is not something that all peoples adhere to. And when you look at the kind of embodied time of different types of beings on this planet, there's really radical kind of departures in terms of how we might think about what time actually means, or how it functions, or how it flows. And because of that, if we don't take into account that kind of discrepancy or those local emergences, either from a body or from a place, I think we're really glossing over some incredibly important things, just in the same way that if we take man as the kind of signifier of the Anthropocene, we're also glossing over so much important political work that needs to be done. So in the case of plastic, it's not enough to be able to show that it occupies a particular register in the stratigraphic layers, as plastic is composed of the compressed bodies of ancient plants and animals themselves unearthed. So in other words, plastic would have to be read in at least two ways: through its contemporary placement and through its ancient origins. But this already begins to complicate the presumed linearity of materialized time that is the Earth's strata, right? And then what happens when a creature comes along and then potentially eats parts of this and then goes off somewhere else, right? Again, you're entering into these other kinds of temporal frameworks. So this suggests that there are multivalent ways to read these layers of the Earth. It might be more helpful to think in terms of what Barbara Adam puts forward as the term timescape in Timescapes of Modernity, where she argues that she extends the landscape perspective to the dimension of time with a view to grasp ecological phenomena as complex webs of interdependent temporalities, and where timescape is constituted by anthropogenic and natural beings in interaction, rather than as a kind of temporal framework where there exists some kind of time that has no perspective, right? Like it's a time out of time, a time that's completely and utterly disembodied. So another way of like thinking through this is also like, what are the ethics of geologic time, or what are the ethics of deep time? Because I think that this is something that comes up again and again when we're thinking with these kinds of incredibly long histories of things like fossil fuels, right? And one of the things that have always been a bit concerned about is the kind of appeal to deep time, the ways in which it can go, I think, in multiple different directions. So acknowledging the ways in which plastic is being absorbed back into the Earth as these various kinds of rocks, for example, could be read as a kind of absolution from ecocidal guilt, right? So we could just kind of say, well, you know, it's going back into the Earth anyway, it's becoming part of the Earth, it doesn't really matter, right? Ultimately, it doesn't matter, right? There's no kind of consequence. The perspective of deep time, the thinking with the geologic offers, can slide into what I would call a kind of nihilistic non-accountability, right? Where extinctions were always inevitable, and the slow violence of toxic accumulation, starvation, or entrapment in plastic for humans and other animals and other beings of all kinds is like not important. So plastic as geology suggests an overwhelming time scale that resists the ethical demands of human and social life. So because geologic time is difficult to fathom, and also promises a certain kind of a comfort with all incorporated back into an indifferent Earth. So within this conception, the Earth is inconsequential to human dramas, right? It kind of reinscribes again this fundamental separation or division between humans and the Earth. So plastic could simply be one object among the many forms in the universe, emerging and unfolding back into the immanent materiality of the universe itself, right? So I think this is one of the kind of dangers when we appeal to something like deep time or geologic time, which many people have done for very good reasons, but I mean, you can see how it can easily slide into these kinds of political gestures. In another way, though, the supposed indifference of geology to humans, the ways that geology fundamentally exceeds humanity, offers also, I think, a return to vulnerability through the asymmetrical dependency of humans on the Earth, right? So this vulnerability, Myra Hurd argues, calls for a heightened, not diminished, assumption of responsibility, a future environmental ethics that depends upon remembering what we have forgotten. And environmental ethics concern not only with the past and present damage, but also with future unknowable vulnerability to harm. For although it is not certain what plastics is really doing by encasing the planet, there are multiple harms that are caused by plastics production and distribution that are very well known and very documented, including like the production of PVC, the production of any kind of endo-disrupting chemicals that are added to plastics, anything that is produced with a vinyl monomer, actually not just PVC, but any kind of vinyl monomer. There's all kinds of, I could go on, but there's there's all kinds of well-documented harms that are associated with plastics. But just because many forms of other than human life and non-life are also potentially indifferent to human action, right? Like, so what does it mean for this beach to then be composed of all of this plastic? Does it matter to the beach, for example, right? Does not mean that we can afford to be indifferent to that question, right? Like, I think that, for example, Elizabeth Pavanelli has argued, drawing on the epistemologies of her Caribbean colleagues, if we wish to continue in our current form, that is, as embodied humans, we might want to also be paying attention, calling forth or turning toward or visiting particular sites, for turning away in the kind of way that we have in a kind of Western sense of like really not paying attention to the world that we're actually in, might cause a kind of turning into another kind of existence. So in other words, if we don't ask the beach, is it okay for the beach to now be composed of plastic, and we don't get a kind of clear response, like that is the kind of ethical question that I think we have to start entering into, because it's like that kind of attention is what also will constitute a kind of human health and flourishing, right? So that we actually have to think of ourselves in a really fundamental way, it's fundamentally intertwined. So in turning away, there's a risk of becoming not what you are, but what you are in a different arrangement of existence. So, we might continue to exist, but we might continue to exist as bacteria or as rocks ourselves, or as earth. And I don't know about you all, but I think most of us are pretty attached to the idea of some kind of continuing human or at least multicellular existence. So the asymmetrical dependence of humans on the earth would seem to invite then more care, right, rather than less, a more careful attitude to prevent the turning away or the withdrawal, to prevent it from becoming indifferent, so that the indifference of the earth might actually be a result of our own indifference. Additionally, if humans are understood to be one expression of nature rather than a fundamentally separate form from it, many of these questions of indifference or the difference between kind of geology and the human world in some sense become mute, right? So it's really a matter of what is causing harm and to whom and under what conditions, and less a matter of a kind of categorical difference. So caring for each other in that sense could also be understood as a kind of care for the earth, and the earth's care is expressed in and through people. So the modern era, what Pavanelli calls settler late liberalism, in many ways could be described as the forgetting of this essentially important lesson, evidenced by rampant pollution and disregard of non-human life, which, as she says, quote, often creates deserts, dry patches, and absences as the signs that a form of existence has turned its back on that which was within it, dependent on it, but careless towards it, end quote. The unthinking relation toward material existence embedded in plastic's disposability characterizes this careless era of spreading deserts and other signs that the earth has turned its back in response to the ravages of racial capital. So plastic tries, unsuccessfully, to coat over and cover up these damages, but exacerbates them in the process. So just one more kind of way of thinking through the kind of question of temporality in relationship to plastics, and then I'll end. So the last way to think about that, or at least that I've been thinking about plastic in relationship to time, is through the times of petrochemicals, right? So, and this I've been calling Petro-Time. So by this I mean really attending to the ways in which plastics are circulating, both as a kind of fossil fuel and also as a set of petrochemicals. So the effects of oil's haunting, its afterlife, are not necessarily immediate, but involve the manipulation of generational forms in the future. So, for example, this is a petrochemical factory located in Sarnia, Ontario, which is like Canada's like chemical valley. There's numerous chemical valleys around the world, but this is one of them. And one of the things about the kind of exposure, the kind of ongoing generational effects of the exposure to various kinds of petrochemicals, is that the ways in which the relationship between exposure and potential harm is is again also not a linear process, or not in the ways in which we normally think of it. So, for example, some types of exposure, some types of harm can show up to 2 generations later. A pregnant person, for example, can have the fetus's gametes affected by chemical exposure. And so this causes all kinds of problems, right? Not only in the kind of effects, the ongoing effects of what does the saturation of our world mean, because we have so much petrochemicals circulating all of the time. What is it actually doing to our bodies? We have no idea. But also, or rather, it's not that we don't have any idea. We have ideas of very specific forms of harm, and then there's a lot of unknowns. But then there's also this question of all of that obviously completely exceeds the kind of normal temporal schemes of legal justice frameworks, right? Like, how on earth are you going to go back and sue a company that you were harmed from your grandmother's exposure, right? That's an incredibly difficult legal mechanism which we don't have adequate responses to at this moment in time, right? Not least because most of those companies have been bought up and sold and don't exist often in many cases anymore after many generations. So this is what one of the kind of processes that I've just been describing is what somebody like Michelle Murphy has called latency. So referring to the intergenerational unfoldings and foreclosures of distributed reproduction under chemical regimes of living. It describes the weight between chemical exposure and symptoms, the ways in which temporal lag sometimes appears generations later, distributing harm, and renders the haunting of petrochemicals pervasive. In a lot of these places, right, the question of like how long these petrochemicals are going to continue to contaminate soil or water is also like a very much an unknown thing. I mean, many of these chemicals are called forever chemicals, right? So we're also dealing with this incredibly long kind of geologic time scales as soon as we start thinking about the kind of saturation of petrochemicals and what does that mean for generations into the future as we're kind of, building worlds that they are going to have to be dealing with, right? Murphy writes, to be latent is to be not yet, a potential not yet manifest, a past not yet felt, but a past that's like there nonetheless, right? So latency is the lag between exposure and effects within a regime of chemical reproduction, which necessitates, again, a nonlinear accounting of time. So Petro-Time, as I've tried to theorize it, is an inhabitation of the earth by fossil fuels for millennia to come, but more immediately describes the invading toxicity in bodies, the accumulation or residence of toxins that don't metabolize or break down. But it also, Petro-Time, I'm proposing, describes the compression of time. So through the bodies of the long dead plants and animals into oil, when burned or used in plastics, this geologic compression of time is then unleashed, right? So we're dealing with the massive kind of proliferation of this kind of unleashing of almost like a compressed, a can of time that's like been massively unleashed, which, in my mind makes a lot of sense for the kinds of changes that we're seeing as a result of climate chaos. So even though oil through plastic participates in the same time-eating acceleration that characterizes petrocapitalism, and it is also one of the main residues of this time. So technofossils and petrochemicals refuse to disappear and will continue to haunt and exist intergenerationally. The notion of progress and utopia subtends the emergence of plastic, yet once it is released or unleashed, the neat relation between cause and effect or linearity becomes scrambled. So time itself is plasticized in these configurations, right? That there's like so many multiple conflicting and colliding temporalities that are embedded in this particular material. So Petro-Time describes an unruly relationship to time that folds and bends from the deep past into the deep future. And we can think of this as a kind of haunting. So as the sociologist Avery Gordon writes, haunting raises specters, and it alters the experience of being in time, the way we separate the past, the present, and the future. So haunting in Petro-Time involves humans and long-dead organisms that compose fossil fuels, and that both refuses to go away, but that is also kind of reminder of our ancestors or an indebtedness to the earth. So I'm going to stop there, and happy to take whatever questions you have.